A reading of Psalm 8, the Message version. God, brilliant Lord, yours is a household name. Nursing infants, verbal choruses about you. Toddlers shout the songs that drown out enemy talk and silence atheist babble. I look up at your macro skies, dark and enormous, your handmade sky jewelry, moon and stars mounted in their settings. Then I look at my micro self and wonder, why do you bother with us? Why take a second look our way? Yet we've so narrowly missed being gods, bright with Eden's dawn light. You put us in charge of your handcrafted world, repeated to us your Genesis charge, made us lords of sheep and cattle, even animals out in the wild, birds flying and fish swimming, whales singing in the ocean depths. God, brilliant Lord, your name echoes around the world.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
I shared the notes of this talk with Brian yesterday, as I always do, because they're my first reader and first feedbacker. And what Brian said was, "Yep, it's your greatest hits." But he said it like that was a bad thing. You know, like you wouldn't say to ABBA, "I don't want to hear your greatest hits." Right? So anyway, I am assuming that my greatest hits are great, just like yours would be. But for anybody that likes their sermons short and really, really sweet, here's a 2-sentence summary of what I'm intending to try to say today. And if you close your eyes after I say this, you can pretend like you're meditating. The question I'm trying to respond to is, how do we handle knowing what we know? And what I want to suggest is that the way we handle knowing what we know is by prioritizing practices that will enable us to internalize the belief that we are a little lower than the angels. Or as the Message translation has it, we've narrowly missed out on being gods, right? It's a metaphor, and it's not saying we should have bigger egos. Or actually, it might be saying, I think some of us need to have bigger egos. What it's saying is we shouldn't have deflated egos or unhealthily inflated egos, but an appropriate sense of ourselves, which is a little lower than the angels. That's a long 2 sentences. I've been thinking about a performance that Brian and I saw last week. It's called Dual Reality. D-U-E-L, like a duel between two people over honor codes. But it's a kind of an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. It's by a Quebec-based theatre, dance, acrobatic group called Seven Fingers. It's amazing. And it does something really simple but really clarifying. When Juliet's suitor, Paris, dies at the hands of Mercutio, and in this performance, Mercutio and Paris are literally flying through the air, being propelled up by a massive seesaw. If you get the chance to see this, it's amazing. When Paris dies, the two teams, or the two tribes, the Montagues and the Capulets, who are at each other's throats, the dancers in this performance took their shirts off as a response to the death of Paris. One group of people taking red shirts off, and one group of people taking blue shirts off, and revealing that they all had black shirts on underneath. It's a really simple image that we're all on the same team, and we pretend to ourselves that we're not, and we evolve political structures that keep us apart from each other. And some of us make choices that keep us apart from each other, and some of us choose to behave in ways that it would be wise to keep your distance until those people have decided that they're going to commit to not harming anybody else, whatever their beliefs might be that this simple image of we're all on the same team is the kind of simplicity that's often downplayed or even scorned in our culture. Now, of course, some things are very complicated, and they are worth talking about in a very complicated way. But there are good reasons why spiritual wisdom traditions present the most important things in simple language. Language that is basic enough to be understood by anyone. Don't do to other people what you wouldn't want them to do to you. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. I think one of the reasons that spiritual wisdom traditions put it simply is that simple phrases are easy to understand. If you think about, they're also quite effective in the world. Think about how political movements that capture the imagination are often the ones that present their vision in the most basic terms. I mean it. Simple slogans win elections. I bet you can think of some. Whether or not the ideas behind those slogans are good. I yearn for such simplicity to be loudly signalled by those who want to promote the common good, the expanding circle of belonging, and the belief that no life is worth more or less than any other. Political movements that seek the common good often overcomplicate their rhetoric, implying that you need a theoretical PhD to understand what the world needs now. What the world needs now is love. I think one of the things the world needs now is a political movement that has a slogan, something like, take care of each other and the earth and make a fairer world for everyone.
Amen.
I think we also need to pay more attention to the role that simple everyday acts of kindness can play in waking us up into a better world. Over the past week, I've experienced the mutually reinforcing light that we join when one person offers hospitality to another in a really special way. I experienced such kindness throughout the day for 5 days on a short trip with Brian, where the hospitality was remarkable. It's never been clearer to me that a smile, a warm glance, an opening of a door, or an encouraging word creates a third living being in addition to the two people in the encounter. The person who is having the door held open for them and the person holding open the door. And then there's a third thing that comes into being. Your kindness and my gratitude mingle and become something more than the sum of their parts. And the same is true in reverse, because when we lean into cynicism plus cynicism, it creates a third thing too. And I would call that third thing a disaster. It's the disaster of human beings not treating each other as what we really are, a little lower than the angels. Or, as that translation we've just heard says, human beings are so magnificent that we've only narrowly missed out on being gods. But if we're a little lower than the angels, if we've only narrowly missed out on being gods, why do we often treat ourselves as so much less than that? As if we're merely shadows or even monsters. And why do we feel so much despair? I think there's at least 2 reasons why the current moment lends itself to despair and a lack of self-love. Both of these reasons have an upside, and both create unintended negative consequences. The first reason is, in my experience, and what I observe in the world, and maybe you do too, is that the circle of belonging is actually expanding through evolving empathy for a wider group of people than before. For some of us, sectarian boundaries are dissolving. In the past, our circles of empathy didn't extend much beyond the village we lived in or the socioeconomic group we identified with. But thanks partly to the evolution of storytelling and contact between people across lines of difference, more people care about more people. And the unifying characteristic that leads us to care is the humanness of the other person. Not their politics or gender or race or sexual orientation or bodily condition or age or resources, but the fact that they are made in the image of God is enough of a reason to treat them as being a little lower than an angel, just like us. Now, I don't mean that that's what's happening everywhere all the time. Obviously not. There is obviously sorrow and brokenness in the world. But alongside that, what's obvious to me is that vulnerable human-to-human connection appears to be more visible than it has ever been, particularly in public. The possibility exists that one day, the most obvious thing about human beings will be that we love each other. It's a possibility. But the unintended consequence of the expansion of the circle of belonging is that too much empathy is hard to live with. I find it hard enough to live with my own pain, never mind to experience the pain of another. When that other isn't limited to the person I live with or the folks in my everyday community, but includes people on the other side of the planet, whose immediate suffering is constantly broadcast to a device that I carry in my pocket and keep on my nightstand, unless I have experienced the relevant spiritual practices and found a deeper sense of who and what I really am in relation to wider reality, I can feel overwhelmed to the point of despair, powerlessness, and worst of all, guilt-ridden passivity, where instead of doing something about the pain of people whom I might actually be able to help, I sometimes wallow in the shame of having more than I need. But then I don't actually help anybody that has less. The second reason for the widespread despair, powerlessness, and guilt-ridden passivity is that we live in a time when we know more about things than we ever did, but we haven't yet evolved adequate structures of wisdom to assist us in discerning a proportionate response. We don't know how to know the things that we know. Never mind how to handle the things that we don't know. It's less than 25 years since we saw planes fly into New York buildings, followed by bombs flying into Afghan and Iraqi cities, followed by images of unimaginable suffering in military prisons and desert lairs. It's less than 8 years since some of us had our sense of confidence and the future path of the nation and the world radically challenged against our expectations. It's less than 4 years since we experienced the threat of a global pandemic and the grief that came to many of us in the sudden loss of loved ones to a disease that only a few months earlier did not exist. At this point, I could just say, we can give ourselves a break, you know. We've lived through a lot. We've lived through a lot. At one level, it can feel like the sky is falling everywhere. Though, if you actually look up at the sky, you'll most likely see that it's still there. And if it's falling where you are, there may be options. It may be time to ask for help. It may be time to leave. Or it may be time to decide that the most life-giving and self-loving thing for you to do is to stay and help other people. To plant your apple tree, even if you think that tomorrow the world will go to pieces. But what does it take to plant trees in a land that looks like a desert? As Mahan says, the main thing that privileged people have lost in the past few years may be a false sense of certainty about the future. But the positive consequence of getting rid of false certainty is that it leaves room for faith in the things about which we can be certain. The greatest of these things is love. And to experience love, or to experience anything actually, it takes the recognition that your life is not provisional. Your life is not a rehearsal. One of the biggest threats of the current moment, I think, is that we would miss our lives. We would miss actually living our lives. Partly because we're so busy, partly because we're so overwhelmed by stories, even good ones, partly because one of the loudest stories in our culture is the one that says we're living in a state of emergency and we're going to have to spend the rest of our lives in crisis mode to solve it, along with the story that says it can't be solved. A story that says our lives will only be a rehearsal for a play we will never actually get to perform. Beneath all that, I think, is a story that says that to be kind, to be merciful, to be non-violent, or even just to be less violent, to seek the good of all, in short, to be loving, might be a nice idea, but it's ultimately not a realistic way to live. As you might imagine, I beg to differ. I imagine you do too. People who think love is unrealistic may actually have an unrealistic view of reality. I would suggest that if there were a shadowy conspiracy to prevent the emergence of a world in which everyone would live underneath their vine and fig tree in peace and unafraid, if there were such a conspiracy to stop that from happening, a really effective version of that conspiracy would be to convince us that devoting ourselves to love first is incompatible with being realistic. If that is a lie, if it is a lie that devoting ourselves to love first is not compatible with being realistic, then one of the most important things we can do is to become present to reality, or at least a more realistic illustration or understanding of reality. Might seem like an obvious question to ask, what is reality? But I wonder if we ever actually ask it. So let me suggest a definition of reality, rooted in personal experience of suffering and healing, paying attention to the psalm that we heard earlier, and to the lives of the wisest people I've known, and trying to listen to the spiritual teachings that have stood the test of time. And I invite you to test this definition of reality, knowing that it is at one level only a story, but if it is a truer story than the ones most loudly told, this story might help save our lives from despair and apathy on the one hand, and from panic and overwhelm on the other. One warning, however: stepping into this story depends on opening to the possibility that you might be lovable and have something lovable to offer the world. This is not easy for some of us. It's a bit of a risk to let yourself be loved. But I think we're amongst friends. So, can we try this? All right? So knowing that words cannot contain it, and that my words will likely mean different things to different people anyway, let's risk a definition of reality, or at least one part of the path we must take in order to be able to recognize reality. That each of us may be a universe containing and contained by love. And this love can hold both anger and peace, strength and beauty, service and gift, light and hope, grief and ecstasy, creative urge and overwhelming awe. Nothing need stand in its way. Such love can go straight to the center of heaven or even to the center of hell, and its integrity will not be tainted, and its unfolding will not be suppressed. And if this is reality, if we ourselves are the container for reality, then we are invited to do what will inspire love. And when I say inspire, I mean inspire, make it breathe. Do what will inspire love, and let it breathe, because your life is not provisional. Your life is not a rehearsal. Your life is right now, and you are a little lower than the angels. You've narrowly missed out on being a god. And if you didn't know that before, it's not too late. There is an eternal unfolding to be joined with, a cosmic love stronger than death, a silence louder than thunder, being made with you in mind. You are bigger and better than you think you are. You are a little lower than the angels. You've narrowly missed out on being a god. Your life is not a rehearsal. You're a bearer of gifts. You're not a beggar. No wonder we are told by the carpenter from Nazareth that history, the law, the prophets are summed up by the command to love. to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love our neighbour as ourselves. But this command is not there to punish us if we fail to keep it. Rather, it is both a declaration about the nature of reality and a clarification of the path to find reality. If God is love, then reality is found through devoting ourselves to love of what is, to love of our neighbours and our enemies, and to love of ourselves. I really mean what I'm about to say. What is asked of us is both so enormous that it can cast stars into space, and it is so small that it affects how you're sitting in relation to the person next to you in this room right now. You're sitting next to someone right now who is narrowly missing out on being a god. Look around at these near gods. None bigger or better than anyone else, and none less than. What is asked of us is to devote ourselves to love, and to loving and to being loved in our waking and our sleeping, our going out and our going in, our interactions with the whole wide world and the bathroom mirror alike. Easier said than done. So let me suggest a few things that could help. If the idea of loving God is a challenge because of negative images of God you've received, or the impact of people who claim to be acting in the name of God, then I invite you to take the risk of exchanging those images for life-giving ones. Trust me, if it expands the circle of belonging and looks like compassion, then it looks like God.
Well,
if the idea of loving your neighbour seems like a stretch because you feel you have nothing much to give, consider the stories told throughout history and this circle of when a smile, a touch, a widow's mite made all the difference. Your presence matters more than your talents. If the idea of loving enemies seems like a bridge too far, know that you're not alone. We've all had experiences of pain caused by others, and we've all heard superficial ideas about forgiveness that imply pretending that the pain didn't matter in the first place. But I say that pain is real, and forgiveness is a journey beginning with the decision to not take revenge on the one who harmed us, even if we feel that we'd like to. And this journey should not be rushed. If the idea of learning to love yourself feels impossible, you're definitely not alone. Some things take longer for some of us than others. But there is a circle here, right here, that will hold space as we heal into loving ourselves. That circle has room enough for everyone to sit down, get their needs met abundantly, and share their gifts extravagantly. It's a circle where wisdom, mercy, and truth belong together, nested under a definition of love that transcends greeting card sentimentality. Mike Riddell, one of my spiritual fathers and deepest friends for a quarter century till his death 2 years ago, defined love as the willingness to bathe the hemorrhoids of a stranger who can't do it for themselves. That image may make you laugh or turn your stomach, but if you imagine yourself as the one being bathed, you might experience a kind of light you didn't know before. So I want to conclude by offering a reframe of something we may think we know so well that we hold it in our heart. But I wonder if we've ever actually touched it. How to know what we know and how to handle knowing it must begin with finding out who we are in relation to reality. We've narrowly missed out on being gods. We're a little lower than the angels. We're lovable beyond imagination. The wisdom traditions that have lasted throughout history share a universal tenet. We call it the Golden Rule. It shows up in the Christian tradition as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus enlarges this frame by saying that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and that the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbour as yourself. We've often been reminded that the teaching is not love your neighbour instead of yourself. That, of course, is entirely true. But I want to go a step further in helping us internalize or even to embody the teaching in a way that might do justice to the idea that the selves we're talking about loving are a little lower than the angels. I'm going to read paraphrased variations of this teaching from a range of world religious traditions. And I want to invite you to take whatever posture helps you almost not think, but just receive. Whatever posture that is for you. You might have feet on the floor and your eyes closed, it might not. Whatever works for you. And when I read these, I don't want you to focus on the subject of the teaching. In other words, when I say, love your neighbor as yourself, I don't want you to think about how to love your neighbor. I want you to think about how God loves you so much that God is asking everyone else on the planet to love you as much as they love themselves. Because you are their neighbor. In other words, in order to hear these teachings in a new way, hopefully to let them permeate us a bit more, so that we taste what it is to be a little lower than the angels, I'm inviting you to switch the subject of the teaching with the object of the teaching. Does that make sense? So when I say love your neighbor as yourself, I want you to imagine that you are the neighbor. And that God cares so much about you that God has asked every human being to love you as well as they love themselves. Let yourself be the neighbor who is lovable. From the Baha'i tradition, lay not on any soul a load that you would not wish to be laid upon you, and desire not for anyone the things you would not desire for yourself. Blessed is she who prefers her sister to herself. What if you are the preferred sister? From Buddhism, treat not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. What if you are the other who is worthy of protection from hurtful things? Christianity, you shall love God and love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. What if you are the neighbor who deserves to be loved? In fact, could it be true that Jesus says that everything that matters somehow depends on you being loved? From Jainism, in happiness and sorrow, in joy and in pain, we should consider every creature as we consider ourselves. What if your pain and your joy matter as much as the pain and the joy of the most visible among us? From Judaism, never do to anybody else anything that you would not want someone to do to you. This is the whole Torah, all the rest is commentary. What if you are the one God cares for so much that God instructs people not to treat you in ways that they would not want themselves to be treated? From Hinduism, this is the sum of duty. Do not unto others that which would cause you pain if done to you. From Islam, not one of you truly believes until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. From the West African Yoruba people, if somebody stings a bird with a sharp stick, he should be the first to try it on himself and realize how badly it hurts. From Taoism, regard your neighbor's gain as your own gain and your neighbor's loss as your own loss. What if your joy should be celebrated by all and your grief lamented by everyone? And from the Native American chief Dan George, we are as much alive as we keep the earth alive. What if we belong to each other? What if we really mean it when we say that? What if the foundation of all law, the purpose of existence, and the balm that will heal us is for us to love you and you and you and you? What if you are the object of the teaching, not just the subject? What if it is as important for you to receive love as it is for me to give it? If this is the core of the teaching that all spiritual wisdom traditions enshrine, then maybe we can know this. You're not the only one receiving it. everyone around you is receiving it too, or it is at least being offered to them? What would it be like to be in this room believing that everyone else in this room is also committed to this practice of learning to love and be loved? I do believe, actually. That's what I see, and that's what I experience in this circle. And it's not about inflated egos. What if we all believed that we were all committed to this practice of learning to love and be loved? Because we're all worthy of all the love that is in this room and in this universe. And the future, from the bathroom mirror to the healing of the planet, might depend on taking ourselves seriously enough to at least experiment with seeing ourselves for what we truly are. A little lower than the angels, not rehearsing for life, but doing the show right here and right now. Amen.
Amen.